Okay, let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot of great questions to ask and two amazing people to ask them of. Cassidy, would you go to the next slide, please? For this webinar, we do have interpretation. So please navigate to the bottom of your screen and you'll find an options menu. There is a globe icon that says interpretation. And please select that and choose which language you prefer to hear this webinar in. So you may choose English or Spanish at the bottom. And I am going to go ahead and jump to the English channel and give folks a few minutes to choose their interpretation before we get started. And thank you, Adriana, for interpreting today. She has also posted instructions in Spanish in the chat. All right. Let's go ahead and begin. And if you have questions about interpretation, please feel free to use the Q&A to chat with Cassidy, who is my wonderful teammate who is helping to host this webinar. Let's go ahead to the next slide, Cassidy. So welcome to the webinar today, which is on interpreting the unknowns. My name is Stacey Marie Garcia, and I am the program manager in the methodology and practice team at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And I am honored to be moderating this event today with two wonderful people that are joining us. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, welcome. The International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, sometimes called ICSC or the Coalition for short, is the only global network of historic sites, museums, and memory initiatives that connect the past struggles to today's movements for human rights and social justice. We were founded in 1999 and now have over 350 different members across 65 countries around the world. From Ellis Island in New York to former centers of detainment in Argentina to sites that remember and learn from the transatlantic slave trade in West Africa. While our members focus on a range of subjects, what connects us is this belief that history should be used as a transformative tool for positive change. At Sites of Conscience, memory is considered to be the best weapon civil society has against injustices. By remembering the world's most challenging periods and giving voice to those who have been historically silenced, Sites of Conscience seeks justice for harms done so that peaceful futures may take root. For more information about Sites of Conscience and the work that we do, I encourage you all to go to our website or feel free to contact us directly. Our emails are on our page and I would love to chat with you. The purpose of this webinar today, and Cassidy, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So this webinar is part of our 2023 Conscious Matters webinar series. We do these once a month and often feature our members who are doing great work all around the world. And the purpose of the webinar today is to discuss interpreting the unknowns. So at many of our historical sites, museums, memory initiatives, often the available evidence rarely tells the whole story about a place or a person. And long-standing systems of inequality and injustice have often dismissed the experiences of marginalized groups to such an extent that there's often little evidence known about the past. So how can Sites of Conscience and like-minded organizations navigate this difficult fact? How do we tell stories about spaces or people's lives that are not fully known, or there's aspects of uncertainty in them? We invited Margaret Middleton and Daniela Bamundi to join this discussion today about interpreting the unknowns. Margaret Middleton, if you want to go to the next slide, is an independent exhibition designer and museum consultant, working at the intersection of design and social justice. They developed the popular Family Inclusive Language Chart and consult with museums on implementing inclusive practices with a special focus on children, gender minorities, and queer people. Daniela Bamondi is from Via Grimaldi. Daniela has a bachelor's degree in history at the University of Chile. Currently, Daniela is in charge of the Oral Archive and Documentation Center at Parque por la Paz, Via Grimaldi. We are excited to have both of them join us today. Our webinar today is going to last 1 hour, and we have a few questions for both Margaret and Daniela. And during this webinar, if you have questions for Margaret and Daniela, which I hope you do, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will be sure to address your questions at the end. And we promise to end in an hour. So let's begin. And Cassidy, if you could stop sharing screen, that would be great. So I wanted to begin with just introducing both of you and the amazing work that you're doing in two very different places around the globe. So I wanted to begin with the question of just asking you to share with folks a brief summary of the work that you do or your site. And Daniela, I'll start with you if you could talk about your site and the work that you do.
Sí, claro. Primero, bueno, agradecer por la invitación y por la asistencia a este webinar. Bueno, mi trabajo en el archivo oral de Villa Grimaldi consiste principalmente en la producción, la custodia y la puesta en valor de testimonios de sobrevivientes de lo que fue el cuartel Terranova, que fue un centro de detención y tortura que funcionó entre 1974 y 1978 en Chile. En base a la producción de estos testimonios y al consentimiento de los sobrevivientes, se hace un registro de entrevistas en base a una pauta de preguntas semiestructuradas que se encarga de revisar la experiencia de cada sobreviviente en la villa. Además de las víctimas de la dictadura, contamos con testimonios de agrupaciones de familiares de víctimas que sufrieron violaciones a derechos humanos y vecinos también de la comuna de Peñalolén y La Reina en Santiago de Chile que trabajaron para la constitución de la corporación Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi y por ende también en la recuperación del sitio. Todos estos testimonios se encuentran disponibles para consulta pública, tanto para fines académicos como para consulta general. Cabe decir que Villa Grimaldi, como les mencioné antes, fue un centro de detención y tortura que funcionó durante 4 años en el periodo de la dictadura cívico-militar de Chile. El campo de Cuartel Terranova estaba en manos de los aparatos represivos dependientes de las fuerzas de orden y de seguridad de Augusto Pinochet, y que por dichas dependencias pasaron alrededor de 4.500 personas a 5.000 personas, falleciendo más de 400 en dicho lugar, al interior a causa de torturas y malos tratos. La historia del lugar entonces se ha podido reconstruir gracias a las experiencias que estos testimoniantes han prestado debido a que luego de que Pinochet dejara el poder con el retorno de la democracia se intentó borrar y ocultar todo lo que había ocurrido en el cuartel Terranova. Por ende la lucha de la memoria se puede concebir desde este momento en adelante, y este es el trabajo que a mí particularmente me compete en Villa Grimaldi.
Thanks, Daniela, and the whole team for the work that you're doing. Margaret, would you like to introduce yourself and the work that you do around the globe?
Yeah, hi. I'm a museum consultant and exhibit designer primarily. My background is in industrial design. I'm not a historian, but I've been in the museum field for almost 20 years at this point, and so I'm working in the capacity as an exhibit designer. I'm also writing about museum practice and consulting with museums to be like more inclusive places. And specifically in the last few years, I've been working on interpreting queer narratives in museums, which are often left out of museum narratives. So that's a particular interest that I have, but I'm also working in many other capacities where I'm, my background is in children's museums. So I should say I'm joining you from Belfast, Northern Ireland. And so I'm an American living in Northern Ireland. So I'll try to bring both of those perspectives today.
Thanks so much, Margaret, and thanks, Daniela. So we wanted to start with asking each of you to tell a story, a story about how interpreting uncertainty or the unknowns has been a part of your work. It's been a part of your work in two very different ways, and so we'd love to first hear from Margaret a story about how interpreting uncertainties or knowns has been a part of your work, and then we'll ask Daniela.
Yeah, so I'm afraid this isn't much of a story so much as it is a summary. But because some of that work that I am doing in the last few years has been with museums on consulting with on interpreting historic queer narratives, this sort of began as a series of workshops and writings that I was doing about a strategy that I call queer possibility. And queer possibility is really it's a queer affirming method of interpretation that's built on the premise that queerness is not something shameful, and that it is relevant. And I mean that in terms of, the visitor to the museum and also the lives of people in the past. So the reason why this was something that was interesting to me as a queer person who also visits museums, and has worked with clients who have refused to incorporate queer narratives into exhibit projects that I was working on, I really wanted to introduce this or develop this interpretation method. It's related. I place this under an umbrella of reparative interpretation, which is kind of in conversation with reparative description, which is happening in archives and libraries, where the terms that are being used for categorizing things in the archives are being updated to be more queer inclusive, to actually use queer terms. A lot of times, those aren't even present, or when they are present, they're outdated or potentially offensive. So in that sort of same spirit, reparative interpretation is about resisting a dominant narrative that has excluded people from museums and archives. In particular, queer possibility is resisting a dominant narrative that prioritizes cisgender and straight narratives, and actively doing that by naming queerness when it is known, which maybe sounds simplistic, but in my experience, it is not. It needs to be said. And if it is not known, but there's a possibility, to actively posit potential queerness. So that's a quick summary about what queer possibility is all about. And I can link to an article that I wrote about it. It's free, so if anyone's interested in reading it, I can share that.
That's wonderful, Margaret. And yeah, thanks for sharing that. And if you put it in the chat or send it to us, we'll be sure to send it out to everyone who is on the call as well. And thank you also for naming, there are knowns and unknowns in this conversation that we need to name as we're talking about this. So thank you. Daniela, could you tell us a little bit more about how you're interpreting uncertainty in your work, or unknowns, and how that has been a part of your ongoing work?
Sí, claro. Villa Grimaldi constituye un un caso súper ejemplificador para el tema de las incertidumbres en cuanto a la historia. Principalmente porque si analizamos los números de visitas que van al Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi, uno podría observar que un cuarto de las visitas son de colegios. Eso significa que hay muchos años que distan entre las personas que sobrevivieron en el cuartel Terranova, actual Villa Grimaldi, con las personas que llegan a visitar el sitio. Entonces hay cierta como distancia en la narrativa de los hechos. ¿De qué manera aborda Villa Grimaldi esta como distancia entre lo que los visitantes van a ver cuando se presentan al sitio o al Parque por la Paz? De manera bastante empática, por así decirlo. Y yo siempre he considerado que cuando uno se sitúa espacialmente dentro del parque, que un espacio súper abierto, muy amigable, de hecho es de apertura pública, uno puede entrar, es de acceso público liberado, pero cuando uno se planta con los pies puestos en el museo, es interesante porque el museo en sí te habla, te comunica lo que ocurrió allá, entonces no es una especie de distancia tal. Eh, es interesante revisar cómo, sobre todo en el proceso de transición chilena, en el que me imagino que algunos de ustedes conocerán que fue una transición bastante accidentada, donde hasta el día de hoy hay algunos restos o estructuras del régimen de Pinochet que ha sido difícil derrocar en Chile. Por ende, el Parque por la Paz siempre se ha puesto desde un bastión de lucha para que estas visitas, por ejemplo, que tienen cierta distancia temporal con lo que ocurrió ahí, entiendan lo que pasó, no desde el punto de vista del horror. Por eso el Parque por la Paz, por ejemplo, no se construye, no se reconstruye en base a las torturas que ocurrieron ahí, sino que invita a que los estudiantes, por ejemplo, o el público en general, se sitúe y piense un poco cómo se hubiera visto el visitante mismo en esas condiciones. ¿Qué hubiera hecho yo, por ejemplo, como visita en el Parque por la Paz, entendiendo lo que pasó dentro, sin tanto como ir con una historia prefija del lugar, sino que uno va al lugar y de repente, por ejemplo, hay visitas que no conocen mucho del contexto histórico, pero el lugar, el sitio en sí, te narra las historias desde un punto de vista no desde el horror, sino desde el punto de vista de la construcción en educación en derechos humanos, en construcción de la memoria histórica y preservación de la memoria histórica. Eso a mí me parece muy interesante de la corporación del Parque por la Paz, pero claro, como que la distancia la hemos visto y la incertidumbre la hemos visto como un bastión de lucha en el que hemos tenido que operar desde nuestra verdad histórica y desde la verdad histórica que por supuesto es indiscutible, pero cómo lo hacemos para estas generaciones que tienen un poco la incertidumbre de cómo hablar de estos temas, como por ejemplo la distancia de los horrores que pasaron en la dictadura que quizás hoy día serían impensables. ¿Cómo hacemos que estos visitantes con tanta distancia temporal empaticen y entiendan lo que se configuró en el interior? Entonces esa es una manera de ver lo que nosotros lo hacemos desde las visitas educativas, desde la producción de contenido académico o de documentos académicos y también desde los archivos.
Great, thanks, Daniela, and talking about that kind of difference that you're struggling with in terms of the different generations, and it seems like those stories are still being discovered about what has fully happened there as well. So I wanted to ask you both, what suggestions do you have for people who are telling stories about spaces or people's lives that are not fully known or still being discovered? What kinds of questions or considerations or things do you feel like people should think about as they're uncovering these stories, as they're interpreting them, as they're sharing this with the general public? What are some considerations they should be thinking about? And Daniela, let's start with you this time on this one. and specifically speaking to some of these stories that you're actively uncovering and still learning about.
Exacto, sí. Bueno, primero que todo, yo creo que lo principal es entender estos espacios como instancias de comunicación horizontal y no vertical. Por eso es importante que cuando vienen visitas se genere esta especie de diálogo, de saber qué les pasa a los estudiantes, por ejemplo, cuando observan una celda, por ejemplo, que está reconstruida, o cuando observan la cantidad de nombres que se reciben en la villa por el gran número de personas que pasó por ahí. Es importante que se genere como esta horizontalidad y no esta verticalidad para que se dialogue un poco sobre esta multiplicidad de cosas que pueden surgir en base no solamente a Villa Grimaldi, sino que cualquier sitio de memoria. Yo creo que es un lugar donde hay que propiciar este diálogo, esta interacción pasado, presente y también futuro, porque creo que la principal como objetivo de la promoción por la educación de los derechos humanos se tiene que sustentar en este diálogo permanente, constante y, valga la redundancia, dialogante con las visitas que se acercan de manera espontánea, pero también con colegios, con profesores, con adultos que de repente en la villa también pasan caminando y se encuentran con este gran ex centro de detención que de repente hasta los vecinos no lo conocían. Entonces resulta bastante interesante como, más que nosotros como sitio, ofrecer las preguntas que tienen que darse o no tienen que darse, nos gustaría como escuchar las preguntas que van surgiendo cuando estas visitas se paran en el lugar y se genera como este diálogo, como les digo, tanto sobre el pasado, pero también sobre el presente y el futuro. Creo que lo importante es la horizontalidad en la comunicación entre las visitas y nosotros como museo no podemos como coartar esa posibilidad de dialogar con nuevas personas, nuevas visitas, niños, abuelitos, de todo tipo de público.
Great. Thank you, Daniela. And Margaret, curious the suggestions you have for people on this call or other organizations that are like-minded who are telling stories about spaces or people's lives that are not fully unknown or not fully known, and what kinds of questions or considerations should they think about?
Yeah, well, I related so much to what Daniela was saying about horizontal communication with visitors, because, you know, um, I think that my biggest suggestion is to have is to say when we don't have all the answers, and that not in like an apologetic sort of way, but in a like in an illuminating way, because in the case of marginalized histories, you know, um, you know, including queer histories, the lack of material is actually interesting. Like a lack of evidence is evidence, as Sue Ferrantino says, um, and and so letting visitors in on that process is actually um, a real benefit to the visitor. I think we can be really open about the gaps in the archive. You know, in when we're talking about queer people specifically who have been criminalized over time or discriminated against, you know, we've got instances of people destroying their personal effects, family members who destroy letters after someone dies. You know, maybe their story or the queer part of their story was deemed not important enough to historicize. You know, we can extrapolate based on current data that we have about queer people today facing higher rates of poverty, addiction, mental illness. Like we can assume that's been the case for as long as we've been discriminating against queer people. So, you know, all of those add up to being like it makes a lot of sense. And there's something really, I think there's something really useful about that, horizontal, like we're going to just be real about it, and we're going to and explain why it may be that we don't have all the answers.
Absolutely. Thanks for making that connection, Margaret and Daniela. That horizontal line of communication and level of transparency with visitors is so important in this work and indicative of the times and why the lack of evidence is evidence, as you said, Margaret, I wanted to ask you all to share an example of how you or another site has creatively interpreted uncertainties or unknowns in ways that, are not providing the exact answers per se, but are maybe opening up more thoughtful questions or possibilities or a better understanding of why some of these unknowns exist in the first place. So I'll ask Margaret first this question, and then Daniela, I'll go to you for this question. So a specific example that you've seen, Margaret.
Yeah. So I've been I've been raving about this exhibit that I just saw. I guess I saw it a year ago, but I feel like I just saw it because it's so vivid in my mind. It's called Bad Bridget, and it's an exhibit at the Ulster American Folk Park in Omagh, which is in the western part of Northern Ireland. And I visited it twice. That's how much I appreciated it. And what it is, it's an exhibit about women who emigrated from Ireland to North America, like Toronto, Boston, New York, I think are the main cities. And that was during, like, specifically in the wake of the famine. So it's between the second half of the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. And it's based on a research project, and we get the name Bad Bridget from the name Bridget, which was sort of like a way that non-Irish people referred to Irish women, like as a sort of a collective name. So usually derogatory. So you would just, like, perhaps, like, if you were somebody who was rich, employing an Irish immigrant in your house as a maid, for example, like, she would be called Bridget, even if that wasn't her name. And bad because of the fact that most of the women in the exhibit had some kind of dalliance with the law at some point. So that includes, anything from stealing or, criminalized poverty, sex work, things like that. And as you can imagine, like, the stories of poor immigrant women are not fully historicized. Like, this research project was about kind of piecing together fragments. And it's kind of no surprise that, you end up with a bad Bridget, like, quote, quote, bad Bridget, because, the records that we have for them are almost entirely about their interactions with the state. So it's immigration records and police records. So anyway, like, that's obviously not a whole picture. These are, you don't really learn too much about somebody's life and motivations and personality or anything like that from a police record. So what the museum did, the Ulster American Folk Park, what the team did was to use composite narratives, which I think is a really effective technique, where they're kind of pulling together real stories and kind of creating almost a historical fiction out of them that's, like, based on educated guesses that you could make about somebody's life. And those compositive narratives, they hired an author, to, like, a local fiction author, to write them. And I found that really effective and evocative. They used symbolic objects. So most of these people, because they're poor, their objects were maybe not saved and maybe not historicized or archived. So there are, there's an object, like there's a course that we don't actually know who it belonged to, but it's meant kind of as a stand-in for an exhibit about sex work. So things like that. So there's these symbolic objects that are not necessarily related to the stories specifically, but they're related content-wise, and they're all from the right time period. And so, and then the last one being this kind of, there are illustrations in the exhibit that kind of bring these stories to life and kind of posit some faces for people whose photographs were never taken, and whose portraits were never painted, right? There are evocative scents in this space. You can like smell things for each of the different environments, including the old country, the new world, and the ship that they came on. So each one of those has its own scent story, and then audio stories. You can kind of hear voices they're actors reading something that a writer has developed, which I just think this was really brilliant, because you learn a lot about people whose lives don't get talked about, and it's, yeah, anyway. So I'll also link. I wrote about this piece as well, so I'll put a link in the chat for you all.
Thanks, Margaret, and we'll be sure to send that out to everyone. Such a great example, and so interesting to think of the role of artists and writers and musicians, and kind of and thinking about these stories, and what kind of can surface when you interpret it through a different lens or in that way. Thanks for that example. That was wonderful. Danielle, I was going to ask you the same question of kind of an example of creatively interpreting uncertainties or unknowns, and how you've seen that in your work, or another example that you've seen, maybe not at your site.
Bueno, de hecho, hace muy poco recibimos la visita de un grupo de estudiantes universitarios que estaban haciendo un trabajo sobre las experiencias sensoriales, principalmente de olfato, que habían tenido exprisioneros y prisioneras, tanto en su condición como tales, como prisioneros, pero también posteriormente en su condición de sobrevivientes. Esto quiere decir como de qué manera ellos relacionaron su experiencia con cosas sensoriales, con el olfato, el tacto, entre otras cosas. Fue algo muy interesante trabajar con estos estudiantes, porque desde dicha perspectiva se comprendían distintas experiencias de vida de los sobrevivientes, pero en base a un rol específico que les tocó jugar durante el periodo represivo. En este sentido, resultó muy interesante analizar cómo, desde distintos puntos de vista, una experiencia de un solo preso político, por ejemplo, termina siendo diametralmente opuesta a las experiencias de otro prisionero político. Esto genera que coexistan múltiples relatos, cada uno con sus particularidades, en constante diálogo, en constante vínculo y en constante enriquecimiento. Para así formar no solamente un solo relato único, y esto también tiene mucho que ver con lo que decía Margaret, que en el fondo la falta de información es un beneficio para el diálogo entre nosotros como sitio, y también para con los visitantes. Entonces esta multiplicidad de relatos, cada uno con sus particularidades que están en constante vínculo, forman también múltiples relatos que a su vez van generando múltiples y más nuevas discusiones, van sembrando nuevas hipótesis y por ende van abriendo nuevas interrogantes. También en este tránsito del pasado, el presente y el futuro. Y me viene a la mente otro ejemplo que me ocurrió hace poco también, todo en el marco de la conmemoración de los 50 años del golpe de Estado que se conmemoran este año, el 11 de septiembre de este año, que fueron, bueno, el debate público por supuesto que se enriqueció mucho por este evento de los 50 años, y lamentablemente salieron muchas cartas al director, por ejemplo, en periódicos que paradójicamente estaban vinculados a grupos económicos que fueron cómplices de la dictadura, muchas columnas de opinión cuestionando, por ejemplo, la veracidad de algunos testimonios que, por ejemplo, yo he tenido que manejar en Villa Grimaldi, cuestionando, por ejemplo, abortos que tuvieron lugar en Villa Grimaldi como causa de torturas. Entonces, ¿de qué manera yo, por ejemplo, lo abordé o lo abordamos nosotros como el equipo del museo? Es simplemente invitando a esta persona que si cuestiona lo que ocurrió, los archivos están disponibles para que uno lo consulte, no solamente la persona que escribió esa columna, sino la gente que leyó esa columna, la información está disponible para que el juicio no venga de otra persona, sino para que uno se lo haga al consultar, por ejemplo, estos archivos. Entonces, claro, ahí uno podría pensar en esos dos ejemplos de cómo tratar la incertidumbre desde un punto de vista como de la historia no material, que es esto muy de las sensaciones y esta subjetividad, la historia de las subjetividades, pero también este intento constante de, por lo menos en el caso chileno, de decir eso no pasó, eso no pasó, eso no fue tal. ¿De qué manera nosotros nos paramos ante ese debate público? Es simplemente prestando a disposición lo que tenemos, que son los archivos que hablan por sí solos.
Yeah, and also that open invitation that you all have to say, come here, come here and hear these stories and read for yourself and understand what has happened is so important. Thanks, Daniela. I wanted to ask each of you, what has helped you embrace the strengths of the unknowns and the approach to the unknowns from this place of abundance and not scarcity? And that's a big question to ask you all, but to really focus on what are some of the strengths and some things that we don't know or uncertainties about the people or the places that we interpret. And Daniela, I'm going to start with you on this one, and then we'll go to Margaret.
Sí, claro, bueno, la incertidumbre en mi caso particular constituye una especie de fuerza de lucha o un mandato. Ante los múltiples intentos por invisibilizar la historia reciente de lo que ocurrió no solo en Villa Grimaldi, sino en varios sitios de memoria que hoy en día se están intentando consolidar en Chile, no cabe otra respuesta que el contraataque mediante la información, mediante los hechos, y la forma de contarlos, por supuesto, y la forma también de que estas narrativas dialoguen. Si un visitante, por ejemplo, de Villa Grimaldi se aproxima a la villa sin tener ningún conocimiento previo de lo que ocurrió, ahí me parece que la villa es la que aproxima la historia de lo ocurrido desde una perspectiva, como les decía al principio, muy amigable. De cierta manera, por eso se llama sitio de conciencia también, museo de sitio y sitio de conciencia, porque se llama a repensar y a reflexionar sobre lo que pasó en términos no solamente de lo que pasó, sino de lo que está pasando con lo que pasó, por muy enredado que suene. Pensar el pasado en función del presente, al final, y no solo del presente, sino que del futuro. Es como una especie de fuerza que te impulsa ante la falta de información, a trabajar para que esa información de alguna manera pueda ver la luz, porque, bueno, la información, el conocimiento, por supuesto que empodera. En Chile principalmente se tiene una conciencia también de que los derechos humanos son patrimonio de las izquierdas. Entonces, cuando un visitante, por ejemplo, se aproxima sin saber lo que pasó en Villa Grimaldi, se enfrenta a una historia que no conoce, pero que en sí misma se deja conocer. Entonces, claro, desprendiéndose de esas ataduras que en el fondo como que envuelve los derechos humanos, que es un patrimonio de la izquierda, que es algo político y no humano, la persona en el fondo tiene que un poco desprenderse de eso, y lo que la información brinda es un poco sacarse esos prejuicios. Y yo creo que la fuerza motora, tanto de mi disciplina como historiadora, ahí me estoy yendo un poco más en lo particular, pero como lo siento como un mandato, una especie como de vocación inmanente a mi carrera, pero también en mi trabajo como sitio de memoria, considero que es el bastión de lucha para que la memoria histórica no quede en el olvido y se mantenga como tal en función del presente y del futuro.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Daniela. Thanks so much for sharing that, and that there's strength in that constant search and unveiling of the truth that you all are doing. Margaret, this question was really inspired by a conversation you and I had prior to this webinar. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the embracing of the strengths of the unknowns and approaching it from abundance and not a scarcity mindset.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm really resisting that scarcity mindset when I talk about possibility. So I really relate to this question in a big way. I think that, like Danielle is talking about, this connection between past and present, um and a focus on process too. And that maybe embracing that things might change over time, I think is really exciting. We can use unknowns to let visitors in on the work of historians, and to maybe pull that curtain back a little bit. I draw on my experience in science centers, where so much of what we try to do is talk about the process of doing science, not just presenting people with a bunch of facts, because it really does backfire on us when we try to, come across as, um, when we try to assert some kind of expertise as this like unchanging truth, because that as soon as we learn something new and we need to update the exhibit, or we have a new exhibit that contradicts something in the past, now what do we look like? We look like because we just told everybody that we have all the answers. Well, if we talked more about the process of doing history work, as a you know as a vocation, as a job, as a process, um, then when we say actually our understanding has changed, and we actually think that's a cool thing rather than like a embarrassing thing, it means that it opens us up to like change as institutions and professionals. And it also brings visitors along with us so that we don't lose people along the way. And it helps them build their own critical thinking skills, which I think is huge. So yeah, there are a lot of benefits.
It's fantastic. Yeah, there's it's so important, as we've talked about, just to be transparent about that. If when we say we're still learning and we're still uncovering and we're still discovering these things, it lets people understand that they can be a part of that process too, of still uncovering and still learning. We don't have much time left, and we have a couple of questions from attendees. So I'm encouraging more attendees to ask questions in the Q&A. But before we jump to that, I'm going to ask you both one final question, and then we'll ask the questions from the group that we've gotten in. How do we support people in being comfortable with uncertainty? Any suggestions for helping people feel comfortable with uncertainty? And Margaret, I'll start with you, and Daniela, I'll go to you afterwards.
Yeah, I think that one of the ways that we can support people is by making our process really transparent and really like saying how we know what we know, um, and modeling comfort and confidence too. Like presenting things, because I think often, I mean, this happens especially with queer content. There's a lot of like caveats and apologies and, oh, I don't know, kind of language. And it's it shakes the visitor's confidence, and it's like, do you really know what you're talking about? And it kind of undermines that historic process where it's like, there is inference happening, there is interpolation happening, and let's tell you why we do that. It's so much, we come across so much stronger. And I think that helps people feel confident, that we're confident. They'll feel comfortable with uncertainty too.
Excellent. Thanks, Margaret. Daniela, how do you help people feel comfortable with uncertainty? How do you think about that?
Bueno, yo considero que tenerle un poco de temor a lo incierto es muy humano para partir, y considero que también hay que un poco desmitificar la idea de que esta incertidumbre te limita o en el fondo te coarta para dialogar o para conocer otras cosas. Muy por el contrario, yo considero que la incertidumbre amplía, te abre oportunidades. En general, simplemente constituye una oportunidad para aprender. Me gustaría que las visitas a Villa Grimaldi y a cualquier sitio de memoria en el mundo estén motivados incluso por la incertidumbre y por el estado de el no conozco bien lo que pasó acá. Creo que es un motor más que una limitante. Esto constituye y sirve para que espacios como los sitios de memoria o los sitios de conciencia sean una herramienta funcional junto con la historia para conocer lo que no está conocido, para darle certeza a lo incierto, y siento que es una invitación muy abierta para aprender y dialogar.
Great. Thanks, Daniela. And that's a perfect segue into one of the questions that we got from Elise in the Q&A that is specifically for you, Daniela, around dialogue and how exactly does that happen there, and sharing a little bit about how you interact with visitors or how staff encourages dialogue at your site. Elise is curious about how this happens. If you could speak a little bit to that.
Bueno, me imagino que se refiere a las visitas pedagógicas del sitio. En realidad es relativo, porque hay algunas visitas que son por audioguía, que evidentemente no implica un contacto humano solamente con una grabadora, por lo tanto yo creo que eso lo podríamos dejar como al margen de esta discusión. Pero cuando hay visitas guiadas con gente, por ejemplo, del sitio, parte de la coordinación de educación, que es un trabajo aparte al que hago yo, pero que de igual manera levantan muchísima información y trabajan incansablemente por preservar la memoria histórica y también por transmitir esta educación en derechos humanos, son bastante variadas. Primero, por ejemplo, cuando vienen los colegios, yo me he fijado que se generan necesariamente estas instancias de diálogo, porque así, bueno, los colegios lo permiten. En este sentido se generan estas conversaciones, evidentemente dependiendo de la edad de los colegios que asisten, pero se dan estas conversaciones como en base a la empatía, en base al ponte tú en este lugar, en base a qué hubieras hecho tú sí. Todo como en estas como interrogantes como en términos condicionales, parecen bastante interesantes, pero también lo que me parece importante destacar es que a veces para ocasiones especiales también se hacen visitas guiadas con sobrevivientes. Y ahí se genera una especie de diálogo muy, muy, muy interesante porque, bueno, los sobrevivientes, nosotros por ejemplo en el archivo oral contamos con 201 testimonios, entonces dentro de esos testimonios hay algunos que todavía están vivos y que están súper dispuestos a realizar ellos mismos el recorrido por el lugar que ellos mismos tuvieron que pasar, tuvieron que estar presos. Entonces es una narrativa muy, muy, muy interesante porque cada preso tiene una experiencia distinta, obviamente sujeto a sus subjetividades, también como a experiencias de género, a experiencias de distintas edades, son muy múltiples, y la idea es que se genere esto, como este como diálogo de qué es lo que tú quieres entender de lo que pasó acá, de qué manera nosotros te podemos brindar esa información que a ti que a ti te falta o que a ti te interesaría conocer, y se genera este diálogo, esta conversación bastante fluida en el mayor ámbito que se pueda, dentro de todo lo posible. Evidentemente hay algunas visitas que no se pueden realizar tan así, pero lo interesante es la visita testimonial, que bueno, además está decir que los recorridos pedagógicos se hacen en base a los testimonios. Esto por bastantes razones, pero por ejemplo también porque los prisioneros cuando estaban en Villa Grimaldi estaban vendados, entonces todo lo que ellos recuerdan se tiene que reconstruir en base a recuerdos, a historias muy personales, y en base a eso se va construyendo el recorrido pedagógico. Entonces, de todas maneras van dialogando, algunas en menor grado, otras en menor grado, pero lo interesante es que por lo menos desde el parque se busca ese tipo de recorrido, más bien horizontal, como lo hemos conversado en este seminario.
Thanks, Daniela, for sharing more details about how dialogue happens. And we have one semi-related question for both of you from Meryl that's in the Q&A. And I'll read what Meryl wrote and summarize. For both presenters, how, if at all, do you encourage, lead, or provoke your visitors to consider the connections between your work, site, exhibits, the stories you tell, and the current structures? So in a sense, where do you see these injustices and struggles happening in the world today? So I think to paraphrase too, it's, how do you connect the stories about the past and the knowns and unknowns about the past that you all are sharing with the current issues or the current state of what's happening in our world today? Do either of you want to jump in to answer that?
Yeah, I can do that. I think there's a very clear parallel between the fact that queer stories in the past have been very intentionally erased and then accidentally omitted. Especially in the United States right now, there are so many different laws that are preventing teachers and librarians from even discussing gender and sexuality with their students. So I think that it's a direct line between censorship and criminalization in the past. And yeah, and so I think that what that means to me is that there's a huge opportunity there for museums, because a lot of museums are not necessarily bound by those restrictions. And we're seeing very similar laws coming through in the UK. It's all related to the same wave of conservatism. And so I think that connection between past and present, this is just through line, right? And I think to me what that means is that it means that this is even more relevant than it would be otherwise.
Absolutely. And there's so many sites that are making that connection right now and engaging people in how to take action, particularly in the US around some of this. Daniela, curious your perspective on Meryl's question. How are you connecting, the stories of the site to the current issues that are happening in the world today?
Bueno, en dictadura, ya con el retorno de la democracia, se esbozó una especie de idea en que, no solamente en Chile, sino también en el Cono Sur, esta idea del nunca más, para que esto nunca más vuelva a suceder. Sin embargo, en el 2019, por ejemplo, con el llamado estallido social, lamentablemente el Estado volvió a ejercer de manera muy desmedida la fuerza, con la fuerza coercitiva en contra de los manifestantes, y eso resultó en bastantes violaciones a derechos humanos. Por ende, es un diálogo que a mí en lo personal me conflictúa mucho porque, claro, se esboza esta idea del nunca más, pero hace 4 años volvió a ocurrir una especie como de situación, en ningún caso comparable, pero por supuesto que tiene algunas repeticiones, sobre todo en cuanto al uso de la fuerza policial, por ejemplo. Y a mí es un tema que todavía diría que está como en el al debe, por así decirlo, porque eh, la idea de el trabajo con, por ejemplo, los testimonios, que son una piedra angular en el trabajo de la Villa Grimaldi como museo de sitio, para mí constituye un elemento que con su propia fuerza podría movilizar un nunca más. Sin embargo, es lamentable que pareciera que con eso no basta. Entonces yo, la verdad es que me siento como en una posición súper como de conflicto, porque la idea de preservar estos testimonios y de que sean de consulta pública y que la gente pueda venir y acceder a consultar el testimonio que quiera sin ningún tipo, casi ningún tipo de limitación, debería servir para que estas cosas no vuelvan a repetir. Y ese es el motivo también de mi trabajo. Pero al parecer no basta, y lo interesante es pensar como qué son las otras herramientas que tendríamos que nosotros como sitio, también como historiadores o como académicos, de qué manera podemos poner aún más en función del presente y del futuro lo que ya tenemos, de qué manera podemos hacerlo aún más útil. Eh, Porque sí, efectivamente es absolutamente indiscutida la utilidad de estos testimonios, no cabe ninguna duda, pero al parecer sí no son, o sea, sí son insuficientes para que estas cosas no vuelvan a pasar. Entonces creo que es una discusión abierta y pendiente y urgente, sobre todo.
Absolutely. Thanks, Daniela, for speaking to that. And thank you both. You both have such a tremendous amount of experience and expertise to share, and the examples that you shared, the stories that you shared were so important. We are running out of time, and we have some questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to. Some really good questions. So I hope that maybe we can get to that and follow up with the folks in the chat via email instead, since we are running out of time for some of these questions that have come up. But I just want to say thank you so much to Margaret and Daniela. I feel like I've learned so much from this conversation, and I feel like you've left us so many things to think about in terms of how we interpret the unknowns and the power of reparative interpretation. Really thinking through how do we do this in a way that's sensorial, or that involves artists or writers or other interpreters. And how do we really name the unknowns and make sure that we really explain why these things are unknown in our past. And most of these unknowns have come from marginalized communities that the full history, the full story hasn't been told. And that's part of why we're trying to tell these stories. Any final comments before I ask folks to close out from either of you, Margaret or Daniela? Okay. Well, thank you, Margaret and Daniela and Cassidy, who's been behind the scenes helping. And thank you so much for Adriana, who's been interpreting this whole time. As we wrap up today, we'd really love for you all to participate in a brief webinar survey. This really helps us do our work better. So if you're able to answer this survey before we close out, that would be wonderful. And then Cassidy, I'll ask you to share your screen so we can share the next webinar that's coming up. So I can go ahead and share it. It's in November, and it's on environmental injustices that are happening. If you go to our events page on our website, you can find out all of the upcoming webinars. This webinar is recorded, so we post recordings of our webinars online as well, so you can revisit that. And all the links that Margaret shared in the chat, we will share back out with you all via email And thank you all so much for participating. Oh, and Cassidy's going to share the next upcoming webinar that is happening, which is on environmental justice on November 16th at 10 a.m. If you'd like to learn more about the work of Sites of Conscience, or you're interested in becoming a member or connecting with another member, or following up on this conversation in any way, please reach out to us. You can reach out to me at any time, and I'd be happy to talk with you. And just again, thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Margaret, so much for participating in this webinar today and the work that you're doing around the world, to really tell the truth about the past and help us understand a more just and envision a more just future. Thank you all, and we'll close out the meeting today. We'll leave it open for a minute or two to finish the survey. But thank you so much for participating.
Thanks so much for having us.
Muchas gracias.
All right.
Chao, gracias.
Okay, thank you so
Igualmente.
much. Have a great rest of your day. Appreciate everyone for coming. Thank you, Adriana.